Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Microsoft. So it's my pleasure to introduce Gillian Hayes, who's coming from UC Irvine, where she runs the STAR Lab, Social and Technological Action Research. Bunch of stars in the lab. I've known Gillian for a long time. She's sort of bobbed and weaved her way through HCI, UbiComp, and most recently healthcare, which is the thing she's going to talk about today. Actually, all those threads have run constantly through most of her work. On the more social side of things, she's quite an amazing fantasy football player, so I would stay away from that if she tries to get you to put money down on anything to do with football. But why don't you go ahead and take it away, Gillian.
Right. Thanks, Desi. Yes, so thank you all for coming. I know I'm competing with multiple other talks, and thanks to those of you who are joining us remotely. So as Desi mentioned, I'm a professor at UCI. I'm not on Facebook. Don't try to find me there. We can talk about that another time as to why I'm not. But if I were on Facebook, these are the things that you would probably find there about me. So I care a lot about autism and cancer for a variety of personal reasons. You'll hear a little bit about autism today. I care a lot about my Red Sox baseball, and it is baseball season, so yay. My niece, my husband, my dog who blogs, who is typing on my old Dell laptop that we were just talking about in that picture. And at the moment, I care a lot about WISH, because in about 2 weeks, Desi and I are going to have our hands very, very full dealing with the first ever sort of workshop on interactive systems in healthcare that's going to be co-located with Kai this year. And if you're not already planning on attending, please do, because anyone can attend. So yeah, as Desi said, I do research kind of all over the space. Probably the two big themes that run through my work the most are sort of documenting capture and access kinds of recording stuff and kids. So if you keep those two things in mind today, then the rest of this will make a lot more sense. So I'm going to talk today about chronic healthcare for kids and some of the ways that technology can help support what's going on with them. And there's lots and lots and lots of definitions for chronic healthcare. And so we're just going to use this as sort of a working definition for today, that it can be of a physical or neurological. It lasts for an extended period of time, and with kids we're usually talking about a lifetime. Brings about significant change in the life of the patient, and again with kids I would add and the lives of their families, and requires more than the usual amount of care. And if you really want to look at all of the different kinds of definitions of chronic healthcare, these are some references that I would point you to. Just to sort of give you some sense of the numbers that we're talking about here. 1 in 3 people in the US has a chronic illness. This is one of those numbers that people are always shocked by, but actually if you think about things like diabetes and cancer, they're not as shocking really. And unfortunately, these numbers have probably gone up since the latest. I mean, these stats are all from sort of 2005, 2006. It takes a little while for the stats to make their way through the system. But with the sort of rise in diabetes in particular, we think that these numbers are going way up, and particularly for children. There's also a huge rising cost of chronic care. So, for example, $72 billion alone was spent on cancer care in 2004, which is sort of the last time that we have really comprehensive numbers on how much it costs the country to pay for cancer. And these are, a host of things, sort of the direct healthcare costs, the things that have been in the news like crazy recently about, actually treating people and so on, but also lots of lower economic productivity, people being out sick or being out because they're taking care of someone else who is sick. When you think about kids, this is particularly problematic, where parents are out a lot. We also see premature retirement, where it's like, oh, well, I'm sick, or my aging parent is sick, or whoever, I think I'll just go ahead and retire, maybe, some number of years earlier. This is one that actually is probably the only one that's getting better as far as the cost of healthcare, and that's not because of healthcare changing, it's because everyone lost their retirement recently, and so people are now staying in the workforce when they might have left. And then the costs of all kinds of other coping mechanisms. So what we see a lot are people actually moving. With kids, you might move school districts because you're getting better care in a different place, and that might have impact on your job or other things. Moving across the country to take care of an aging relative, those kinds of coping mechanisms. Okay, so some general challenges, and you'll just have to trust me, this is based on lots and lots of research by both me and lots of other people, that early intervention can be really critical. This is true in really any kind of chronic illness, and you hear this a lot, with Alzheimer's, with cancer, with all kinds of things. But with kids, we think this is particularly true because the first 5 years, maybe more, you're still developing, new neural pathways, various other things, and so early intervention may be able to stem the tide of some of the kinds of developmental disabilities that we see over time. Care becomes highly individualized, and this is primarily because chronic care, as opposed to something acute, like a car accident, is over the lifetime, and so the context of all the other things that happen to you in your daily life become much more important than something that's more acute. And this gets into sort of the long cycle of cause and effect because you're making often lifestyle changes, or you're working with someone who's developing still, and so on. You have very long cycles of trying new treatments and seeing what happens. Information presentation for different sort of consumers of that information. What's really interesting with chronic care with kids is how the information that you're giving changes depending on who's getting it. So, parent or a child themselves or a sibling or various other people, as well as this is a patient who is rapidly evolving over time, and they're changing like crazy, both physiologically and mentally. So even the information that you're giving to the patient directly has to keep changing very quickly. And then, of course, much more so than in the chronic illness of an adult, families play a really significant role. And you see much higher divorce rates in families of kids with chronic illness. You see higher problems with workplace and so on, stress. Parents are suffering from time spent away from various activities and all kinds of issues there. So we think, and again, I'm a little biased because I'm a little bit bizarrely obsessed with record keeping, but we think this idea of sort of keeping observations of everyday life, observations of daily living, or ODLs. You may be familiar with activities of daily living. This is essentially observations of those kinds of things. And this is not a term that I came up with. This is one that's been floating around sort of in the personal healthcare space for a few years. And Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has been pushing this concept really, really hard. But this idea that rather than taking these snapshots of healthy individuals, particularly if you think about sort of the well baby visit or even the well adult visit, it's like, okay, what's the weight today? What's the blood pressure today? Those kinds of things. Instead of getting these snapshots, we want to actually take health measures continually and have a much better idea of what's going on. Margie Morris at Intel refers to this as sort of embedded assessment, that if you can embed these kinds of observations into everyday life, we'll have a much better idea of the baseline. And it's much more patient-directed at this point, right? So we're talking about the patients are having to do a lot of the collection and the storage, but they may also get the benefit of doing a lot of the use of their personal health data as opposed to it being a much more clinician-directed model that we sort of have currently. And we think that this can provide custom feedback and inform daily health decisions and so on. And like I said, Robert Wood Johnson's pushing this really hard, so if you're interested in seeing some other projects that are looking at this concept of observations of daily living, check out the Project Health Design website, where you'll see things like Anin Day's work on sensing cognitive decline. There's some work in San Francisco on obesity in teens and trying to understand those kinds of healthcare things, and some various other projects. And so people often ask me, like, what's an example of an ODL or an observation of daily living? It could be really kind of anything. So the big ones you hear are things like sleep patterns, diet, daily weight, those kinds of things. And I'm just going to go ahead and guess none of you woke up this morning and weighed yourself and wrote it down somewhere? No? Does anyone keep a food journal? No. Maybe Desney does. I can't tell what that look on his face is. But this is also a common thing, right? So I can stand here and tell you we think this is really good and everything. We should totally do this. And people kind of know, people tell you all the time, you should weigh yourself daily, you should write down what you're eating. And those are two really simple ODLs, not, these more complex kinds of things that we're talking about. And no one's doing it, right? So this is a huge challenge of, if we think this is good, and we take that as sort of a default position, how do we actually make that possible for people? Now, that said, I'm going to totally skirt that a little bit by focusing on autism and premature infancy, which are places that people are a little bit more motivated than the average healthy adult to take these kind of data. There are also, however, places where it's a lot harder than the average adult to take these kind of data, so trades off a little bit. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what this kind of means. If we talk about kids, now we have a lifetime of records and this sort of like comprehensive digital dossier about their health, their education, their development. What does that mean 50 years from now? I'm going to warn you now, this is going to be kind of a whirlwind, and I'm going to try to talk about a lot of different projects at once. So if you get overwhelmed and stressed out, you can interrupt me, but you can also find some time with me later today or tomorrow morning. I'll be around a little bit in the morning potentially as well. So, okay. So starting with autism, thankfully, autism has gotten a lot of media attention. So I used to have to, when I would talk about autism, explain a whole lot about it. But I've been lucky in that I don't have to anymore. But roughly, we're sort of talking about a developmental disability, usually has social, language, behavioral impacts, although what the severity of those impacts are and how they're particularly constituted in any individual is highly variable. There's sort of the old saying that many of you have probably heard me say before, that if you have seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism. There's just not enough generalizability across the population to really make big, broad statements. But typically, we're talking about something that appears in the first 3 years of life. The sort of holy grail right now amongst autism researchers is to get a diagnosis between 0 and 6 months. That's the sort of boundary that they haven't yet crossed. We can do a little bit of diagnosis between 6 months and a year, but typically we're talking about the 2 to 3 year mark. And so it can often be after what has looked like typical development from 0 to 1, and then we start to see changes, and so that's part of what makes it so hard. And like I said, it's a spectrum. I like to pull this stat every time I give a talk. So you can see at 10:40 last night, the estimated economic cost was, I don't even actually know how to do the numbers that big, and 303,000 people in the U.S. have been diagnosed with autism or somewhere on the autism spectrum. So it just gives you a sense of how big of an issue this really is.
Do we have a pathology or physiology marker for autism yet? What's the state of non-developmental markers for autism?
There's a lot of genetic researchers that are looking. The stats would indicate there is a genetic component, although there have been cases of twins where one develops autism and one doesn't, so it's not entirely genetic. But people are looking for those genetic markers. There's no physiological markers that people feel really confident in right now, but there are also people that are doing things like lots and lots of MRIs and things like that to try to see if they can find any differences. But for the most part, kids with autism physiologically look exactly the same, which is also part of why most people are now arguing that autism spectrum disorder, even if you break that apart into the sort of 5 subcomponents, is still not broken apart enough, and that we're talking about lots and lots of diseases. And it's sort of the equivalent of when people say cancer, it's thousands of different things. And so it's not totally clear yet. So things I'm not going to talk to you about today, but there's been a lot of work in sort of the idea of using sort of ubicomp technologies for treatment and monitoring, some of which has been done by me, but lots of which has not been. So the Aberrus system that some of you may know from Julie Kientz's work, which is really about tracking one-on-one therapy sessions and helping groups to generate better therapeutic data. My dissertation work, CareLog, which was about capturing video records of severe behaviors in classrooms. Tracy Weston's dissertation work, which is all about automatic sensing of self-stimulatory behavior, so things like hand flapping that you hear about with kids, and trying to get sort of strong data on what's going on there. And then Julie's work on the Smart Baby Monitor, trying to detect autism earlier, and she's continuing this work now, and she's just down the road at UW, so if if you guys are interested in that, I would recommend. And then there's a nice overview of some of these kinds of tracking and monitoring technologies. But what I've been interested in more lately is the sort of idea of how do we embed the record keeping and start grabbing these kind of observations of daily living into the other technologies that the kids themselves are using. I had started out in the autism space very caregiver focused. To be honest, caregivers are just a lot easier to deal with than dealing with the kids directly. And that's been really helpful and great in a lot of ways. But now we're thinking about, okay, but there's a lot of things that kids are already doing and using, and we don't understand kind of their use patterns and so on. So how can we sort of embed these things into classroom technologies, augmentative communication devices, which for kids who have trouble verbalizing, you'll see them using a lot of these kinds of devices, and then other kinds of tools for therapeutic intervention. So that's where most of our work has been lately. So I'll just go through a few examples of this. So Mokitos, the idea here is, well, there's a couple things going on here. The first is I'm just sick of the fact that it costs thousands upon thousands of dollars to get an augmentative communication device in the hands of a kid. And this is for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the companies that produce them have sort of a corner on the market of getting schools to pay for them. But they're also developing custom hardware. And the argument there is that, oh, well, you know, the old laptops couldn't, and this was true when augmentative communication started, laptops couldn't handle the abuse. And we were teasing AJ about her ThinkPad earlier. AJ's ThinkPad would not be a good example of something you would use for augmentative communication. Turns out, however, that cell phones and internet tablets can handle the abuse. They're made for people to drop them, throw them, you know, I've accidentally flushed one down the toilet, you know, all kinds of things like this, right? And so our thought is if we can start to use these kinds of off-the-shelf pieces of hardware, then we can make these devices much, much cheaper, and we can also make all the software more open and accessible so that people can program them more easily. Most school districts have a full-time speech and language pathologist whose job is just to program the augmentative communication devices. And it's, from an end-user programming perspective, it's embarrassing. It's just tragic what these teachers are having to go through to get everything configured. So the idea here is to replace things like these analog tools as well as the more custom devices with something more off the shelf. So people can use these tools for sort of supplementary prompts, you know, to help a kid have a visual idea of what you're trying to communicate with them. Selection, you might give choices. What do you want for breakfast? Here's your 4 choices that you can make, and the child can make them. Basic communication as well as sort of mediated speech. There's a lot of interest right now in speech output from visual input for kids so they can communicate in a more sort of standard way. And what we see with these kinds of devices is now that we've got this all opened up, we can also start to generate custom reports. So we can actually find out who are the kids communicating with, who are their communication partners, and what's more likely to inspire communication for an individual child, which is a really important thing. It's often hard with nonverbal kids to tell, are they not talking because they don't want to talk, because they don't like you, or because they're having some sort of other struggle. And so we want to start being able to log those things. And then, of course, the timing and content is just easy to get. I mean, that's a very standard thing. We can get exact timestamps of every single interaction that they're having, as well as what are they choosing. So we start to know things like, is the child always choosing the thing on the bottom right, or are they always choosing the thing that is a particular color, or different kinds of pattern matching? And so we get a whole bunch of data here about everyday use that helps understand a sort of larger behavioral pattern. Similarly, visual schedules are another example of this kind of visual communication that happens in schools. These are actually not totally different than the things you might see in a regular education classroom, which I always kind of excites me. But probably the biggest difference you'll see is a lot more attention is paid to them. So in a regular education classroom, you might see lots of fun, festive, brightly colored things on the walls to help the kids learn. But what you'll see in a special education classroom is very specific pictures that are indicating very specific things. Here we have each color is a different child, and that schedule shows their day, sort of going down the way. And these kinds of things help for kids who might struggle with sort of paying attention to, adapting to, and understanding auditory input. The sort of, hey kids, first today we're going to go over the calendar, and then we're going to have recess, and then we're going to do this. That may be really complicated for a kid with autism, But they have a lot of strengths typically in sort of rote memory and understanding visual input. This is not true for every child with autism, but across the board, that's what we see a little bit more of. So if you can start to recognize that, okay, I can memorize that red is always me, and I can go and look at the schedule and see, oh, okay, this is the picture for group time, so I know that's going to come up next. We can start to, enforce things like feeling secure in the environment, trusting that the schedule is going to happen in a particular sequence of events, being motivated. So if you can't remember from an auditory cue that if you do your work now, you get to go and have a treat later, but you can have it on a visual cue, that's really helpful. I mean, this is true with neurotypical kids as well, right? But also independence and self-esteem, which are huge things for kids with autism. Again, if you're looking at a child with autism, if they're not behaving in sort of, standard, inappropriate, typically autistic kinds of ways, then you may not even have any idea that there's any disability there at all. So if you can get a kid to start being more independent, then they can sort of merge in, be integrated with neurotypical kids, a whole bunch of other things that can enforce greater self-esteem and so on. But using all of these tools, I know some of you have spent a lot of time in classrooms, so they're super hard to create. Whoever invented the laminator should, get some sort of award from schools, because the amount of time they spend laminating little cards and sticking Velcro on the back is really incredible. They're really hard to use and manage, so if something changes, you have to run up and pull every kid's thing down and say, oh, the speech therapist isn't coming today, so we have to rearrange, and it's really, really complicated. So again, we wanted to replace these kinds of things with a digital solution that would allow us to have these sort of faster, easier interactions, have progressive skill scaffolding, and then, of course, embed sort of natural record keeping in what's going on. So that instead of relying on the teachers to say, well, I think John goes and checks his schedule before we go into group work, we actually know whether or not he does and how motivating that is. So what you see here is a classroom that we deployed this in last summer. You have sort of a big screen here that serves as essentially the same as the big displays, the big analog displays that people already had. This is a slightly weird picture because it was a demo shot, so all the kids have the exact same schedule. That's not actually necessary. So each kid still has their individual schedule. And then they have their own personal device that they have sitting at their desk or that they can carry around. And what you see here this is the standard sort of, we're presenting questions to them and they can make their choices. But then you also see the picture of themselves, what they're working towards, what reward they're going to work towards if they get, sort of 5 tokens, because most special education classrooms run on a tokening system. A lot of regular education classrooms do as well. You do something good, you get a star, that kind of thing. So we deployed that last summer over about a month of summer school, and we were pretty surprised actually at how quickly the kids adapted to it and were able to use it. In part, of course, this is because we were largely mimicking what they were already doing in the classroom and using their system. But also, for a lot of kids with autism, looking at a computer screen is just inherently reinforcing. It's something that's enjoyable. And so the kids immediately sort of took to okay, I want to check out this thing and start to use it. A couple of the problems we ran into, the kids were too fast with the new devices, so they were used to actually having the overhead of having a teacher walk around with a paper-based sheet to say, okay, here's your new sheet, point to the right answer, and then they'd take up the sheets and then put out new ones. So for example, calendar, which is the first thing that happens every morning, went from taking about 30 minutes to 5 in the very first day, which was a little bit of a panic for all of us of, what do we do now? So we started working on building better sort of teacher configurations. So the teachers can now go in and actually put information about the individual kids. This one has South Park kids. They can go from there to putting in various things about the activities that they might be doing. They can build in pauses so that they can, do verbal reinforcement in addition to the activities and a variety of things like that. So it's not so computer focused. And then we also show sort of skill progress over time and things like that. That's fake data. That no child would look like that. But you get an idea of sort of, we can start to see okay, if we ask what day of the week is it, are they getting it correct on the first try and it's completely independent, or are we having to do some prompting? Are they always picking the item to the far left? All those kinds of troubleshooting they can generate reports for, and so on. So the new sort of teacher end user configuration interface we haven't deployed yet. That's going into the schools in 2 weeks, I hope, fingers crossed, that we get all of our final approvals in place. I'm sure AJ can tell you about the joy of final approvals with schools. And then we'll have a better understanding of if our sort of end user programming stuff is actually working better as we hope that it is. Okay, so and then one of the challenges with both the Mocatos project and the VSCED project is about getting content in. So there are standard libraries, and the most sort of famous one is the Picture Exchange Communication System, or PECS, where people will actually take these sort of drawings and you can use those. But some kids, that's a generalization, and some kids have trouble sort of understanding this thing. So they would do much better with an actual photograph. So what you see are parents and teachers both sort of struggling to get the digital photographs in. And we allow that in our systems. They can take digital photographs and put it in. But it's all still from the parent or the teacher's point of view. And so we started to think, well, what could we do if we used the SenseCam? Which is in part just an excuse to play with it, because I love the SenseCam. I think it's fun. But, how can we get these sort of automatically generated, situated, contextualized kind of communications and actually allow the parents and the children to use that? SenseCam is... We had originally really wanted to use this as a transition tool. So we wanted to use SenseCam to actually, a kid can wear it all day, and when you go home, the first thing you can do is review what happened at school today. Because for kids who are nonverbal, this is really hard on their parents. And I've had parents tell me,
About the question about visual communication devices in general is that it would seem to me there's a tension between making them as efficient as possible to allow communication and still forcing children to some degree to lean on their still developing verbal skills. I have no idea, is the philosophy that verbal skills are what they are and are really, the goal is no longer really to develop their verbal skills, but to make life as easy as possible with other communication? There's
a huge debate. It's a really good question. There's a huge debate. So Temple Grandin's probably the most famous on the side of, rest of the world, you need to adapt, and if a kid needs to communicate only verbally, deal with it. But there are a lot of people who feel that these kinds of scaffolds are challenging to the kids and that you shouldn't do it, that it's more of a, you should always be communicating verbally and just deal with it. It's similar actually to the debate about baby sign language, if anybody is familiar with that, which is sort of, well, if you teach a kid to sign early, where's their motivation to speak? Versus, but they're communicating earlier, so that's good. And people aren't really sure. My personal feeling on it is probably somewhere in the middle. I've seen some kids that it's very clear to me that they're not going to be verbal. In some cases, it's actually a motor challenge, but in other cases, it's clear they could, and they're just not going to. So what happens typically is you have therapies where it's built in to say, you need to do these very specific protocols using the visual cues, and so you may even hold out the choices, and they'll pick, say, I want a hot dog for lunch, right? But that's not. So that gives you, as the caregiver, the information that hot dog's what they want, and then you can force them to say it. And the reason to do that is because what you see if you don't have the visual at all is parents just guessing or teachers guessing, oh, they probably want a hot dog, or maybe they want chicken nuggets or whatever, and they'll start to use that word. And then you can't tell, is the kid not responding because they don't actually want that thing, or because they can't say the word. So that's kind of where I personally fit, but it's a huge debate. Anyway, right, so SenseCam. So what we started to do was we really wanted this idea of, parents saying, I don't know who my kid's best friend is, I don't know what they had for lunch today, a variety of things that you take for granted if you have a neurotypical kid coming home from school and telling you all kinds of things about their day, perhaps telling you even more than you want to know about your day. So we started to think that this would be really good for transitions. Also, because divorce rates are so high, a lot of participants in various studies have been divorced parents, and they would talk about wanting to know what happened at the other parents, not most of the time, not for sort of spying on the other parent, but more wanting to just be able to talk to their child about what happened. Now, there are some cases where it was less positive, shall we say, with the divorce. But so we started to look at this. It turns out, well, basically, you can't take pictures in schools in this way. There's a lot of sort of legal and policy ramifications around that. So what we wound up doing instead is having it very child and parent focused, and which actually it turned out that teachers want to know just as much about what happens at home as parents want to know what happens at school. So we think this is a good way. We started to see teachers using the pictures that parents were having their kids take with the SenseCam. So maybe this is a way that over time you could imagine school districts trying to get more and more comfortable as they see it as a sort of therapeutic option. We're still running participants and collecting data, but we're starting to think that these sort of, image-based sort of ODLs can help both the children and their parents. And I just have a few sort of example quotes up here. But what you see is, kids who we didn't even know that they had, or they weren't articulating any sort of memory problems, for example. And it's still not clear that memory is the right word, but this is the word that the parents are using, where children are saying, well, now I can sort of be re-triggered with the image. I can talk about it with my parents, or communicate with it with the speech to text or text speech, or however I need to. And that, of course, echoes what other SenseCam researchers have done when they've been more interested in memory specifically. But also, and this is sort of where we started, this is where we started with as far as our hypotheses about what might happen with kids wearing SenseCam, is that you get a different perspective. How much the child's waiting for the world to happen to her, and feeling like, this parent said, I felt like I needed to really start to engage my child more because I became really aware of how much it sort of looked like just sitting in the corner from her viewpoint. Or one case where a parent said that they were sitting there reading music and suddenly realized that their child could read music and had no idea. And, when I tell people these kinds of results, the first response that I get from people is invariably one of sort of, what kind of terrible parents are you working with, that they didn't know this. And so I'll just have to defend the parents for a quick moment to say that, most of these families have more than one kid, and even if they just have the one, dealing with autism is an incredibly taxing kind of situation, and you may be in like 10 to 20 hours of external therapies a week, and your moment in the car when the child is happily sitting in the back seat quiet is your 5 minutes of sort of solitude every day. So not sort of looking in the rearview mirror to realize that the child's sitting in the back seat reading music is not actually that shocking. And especially with kids with autism, where it could be reading music, or it could be, if you just hear it, it could just be flipping pages, because that could just be a stimulatory activity. So this is the kinds of examples of what we see. And again, we're not really sure yet, but we're hoping to see more sort of therapeutic uses for kids, because it is so much from their perspective, and that's something that's often overlooked with kids with special needs. Okay, last autism one, I promise. This is brand new, so we really aren't sure what we're seeing here yet, so apologies. But we've been working with some folks in Southern California who've been working on new kinds of social skills tools. So these are for kids with higher functioning, maybe verbal, but have some trouble sort of engaging with other kids. And so the kinds of examples of challenges that you might see is, they've gotten to start to engage with another kid during recess, for example, and then something happens, distracts them, and they just sort of walk away. And this is a place where, disengaging from that encounter was done inappropriately, and it can cause a lot of trouble, especially for kids who were trying to integrate into sort of mainstream schools. Similarly, sort of personal space is a really big challenge, and that's what this lesson here is all about personal space. So the idea here is they're showing like the kids go through a lesson plan where they draw out this is appropriate distance, and they actually have sort of rules of, half an arm length is okay for mom, 1 arm length is okay for a good friend, and 2 arm lengths you need to have for a stranger, and trying to teach kids about personal space. I actually think that there's some of my students I'd like to teach about personal space in this way, but and the idea here is that there is this compass that helps you with nonverbal communication, emotion, we skills, and social problem solving. And so the typical lesson plan here is to go through a series of steps where they start out with what's the goal of the lesson. So here you have the goal is about personal space, right? And then visual supports. So they'll start off, this is actually 2 different worksheets. So they'll start off here with this is a visual support to help you understand distance. Go through a social story, which is about, Desney and AJ were walking down the street and they were standing this close to each other. And then someone else they didn't know walks up and was standing this close. Oops, that's too close. Say you're sorry. These kinds of stories to help the kids sort of role play. Then there are a series of sort of practice rounds and so on, and then going out into the world and trying these things at home and in other places. So this is a really good place, we think, for mobile tools to help support this kind of thing in the moment, as well as to document, when it's actually happening, when did these sort of social missteps occur, and how can we help them. So we've started looking at sort of building these kinds of visualizations in a augmented reality kind of world. The sensing is, as you can imagine, the hardest thing. Identifying a person and how far away they are from you is nearly impossible on a mobile phone. But we can do a little bit of it in constrained spaces, like in a social skills group classroom where we know exactly who the people are, those kinds of things. You could do it in a home if you know exactly who the people are. And helping to sort of prompt kids, okay, now you're going to pretend, here's your scenario, right? So you can do this in a classroom. Pretend that Carlos is the person you're working with. He's this age. He likes these things. So you can say, oh, I also like chess, right? The funny thing about this is I will not reveal who the person is because he'd kill me. But I was telling a friend of mine about this, and he was like, oh, I could really use that. I think that might help me with dating. And do you think I have autism? I was like, no, I don't think that you do. And no, I don't think you should use this kind of tool for dating. But you can imagine doing these kinds of things in a practice round, or if we ever got the sensing good enough, you could go out and use it in the real world where you see, okay, this kid is a different kind of kid. One's a stranger, one's a friend than this one, and here's some activities they might like and those kinds of things. And of course, what we also really want to get to is sort of daily observations of social skills development, because social skills, basically what you have right now are therapists chasing after children with clipboards to try to, how many times did they initiate eye contact? How many times did they do these other things? And we think if you could have some sort of wearable system to actually record those things, we could start to get some of those kinds of data. Okay, I'm way behind, so we're going to whip through premature infancy. Premature infancy, similar to autism, huge problem, growing all the time. The good thing is we're getting really good at neonatal care. The bad thing is that this means that a whole lot more kids with a lot of risk for chronic health over their lifetime are now sort of surviving the neonatal care and going on to a sort of lifetime of functional limitations. So things like cerebral palsy, asthma, a variety of other issues are all tightly correlated with weight at birth. So in 2002, some pediatricians at UCI started this idea of exercise in the neonatal intensive care unit. Those women in the room who've ever had children, you will be entertained by this. As it turns out, until 1987, the common wisdom amongst all sort of physicians was that, if a baby was born prematurely, you swaddle them up as tight as possible, you don't let them move at all, and you give them really, really high calorie in. It's sort of the couch potato solution to growing a baby. Turns out that in the sort of 80s, people started to realize that last trimester in the womb, all that kicking actually has functional purposes, and it builds your muscles and it builds your bones. And so the idea then became, let's actually do exercise. And you can see one of the nurses doing exercise in the incubator where you actually sort of work out the babies, which is both adorable and terrifying. I don't do the exercise myself. I have this kind of feeling of anything that's smaller than my hand probably shouldn't be exercised by me. But the nurses who do it are really fantastic. Turns out we're growing all kinds of body mass. We're getting better movement out of these infants. How this is going to turn out as they become adults, we're still monitoring. But all this is to say hospital stays are super costly. The average hospital bill when a preemie is released is about $500,000. So as you can imagine, there's a pretty big goal to get babies home as fast as possible and get these benefits extended to the home. So we started a couple years ago to think, well, can parents do the exercise at home, and how do we support them and monitor them at this kind of distance? And you see one of our nurses teaching one of the moms how to actually do the exercises. Our added challenge at UCI is that we're very much a county hospital for a highly Hispanic and Vietnamese population who have lots of language barriers, lots of educational barriers, and so on, and almost none of them have home internet service. So, thank goodness for smartphones. What we started to look at is actually documenting and providing some family provider communication using phones. There's lots of Pew Internet stuff that says that sort of low-income Latino communities in particular are way more likely to access data services on a phone than they are through any kind of computer. It also just makes sense when you're running around and dealing with a new baby at home, and often multiples, because that's often why they're in the premature infancy in the first place, is there were multiples. One little device that's sort of always on in there, it's much more convenient than pulling out a laptop and so on. So in our pilot study, we did a very basic system using my experience where we just said, what's going on, how many times did you exercise today, prompting them to exercise if we hadn't received a record, that kind of thing. Did this in Spanish as well. This is the first time this baby happened to lift its head, and we just happened to be there, so I just love the picture. So we had 10 caregivers. Half of them used sort of my experience-enabled smartphone. The other half used pen and paper, very much sort of a small pilot study, and did 3 weeks of intervention. We didn't see any biomass differences because 10 babies, 3 weeks, you're not going to. But what we did see is that they were actually able to perform the assisted exercise despite telling us before they started that they thought there was no way, almost to a person. They thought, baby's too fragile, I'm too scared, it's not going to happen. And they were very compliant with the exercise routine. They also were more compliant with the logging part when they were using the phone, which is actually not that surprising, because if we didn't get a log from them, then we beeped them. Like, hello, have you done your log today? Would you like to? It turned out that they also talked about being more aware of needing to do the exercises and so on because they were getting beeped about them. We think that there's better logging with the phone as well, because caregivers would talk about forgetting to write down the exercises they had done for a few days and then going back and backfilling the paper-based forms. So we don't know for sure because we don't have the ground truth of having been there, but we think they're probably more accurate with the phone. Probably most exciting for me was this emotional attachment we started to observe with the phones over the paper-based records, where they would talk about, oh, this is a very special device that helps me help my baby, and really loving it and being much more attached to it. And when they were mad about it, they were much more mad about it also than with the pen and paper forms. So you didn't see people getting like, I don't want to take these records anymore with the pen and paper, the way that we'd occasionally see a frustrated parent, get upset with the phone. So it was just a much stronger tie there. So we're trying to figure that out a little bit more. We also found, of course, all kinds of needs, which is what we're working on now. So there's, the need for more interaction between caregivers, storage of data in a third-party repository instead of in this weird sort of hybrid of the phone straight into the electronic medical record. The parents couldn't really get access in between. And the visualization and sharing of the data back to the caregivers, which we kind of knew going in, but for a variety of reasons didn't get that implemented in time. Improved educational materials, so they're very much getting just a basic notebook with pictures of the exercises and things like that. We know if we give them phones, we can give them videos and more interactive kinds of tools, and then additional automatic sensing. So this is mostly coming from the clinician side of people saying they want to get things like movement and weight on a daily basis at home, and the parents don't want to record that, so we need to do the automated sensing.
Jay?
Yeah.
Clarification. So with the phone condition, you actually reminded them as well as giving them the phone, and you didn't do that in the paper version, is that correct?
Right, so in the paper version, they got a call from a clinician once a week for the 3 weeks. In the phone version, they got just an alarm on the phone at I think it was 8 o'clock each night. If we hadn't, they could launch the log automatically, or manually rather. If we didn't get a log from them, then they would get dinged at 8 o'clock to say, please give us a log. Based on our records, they were almost totally compliant with logging in both cases. But The challenge of this, of course, is we reminded them in the phone case, and in the paper case, they could go back and do it later. So we don't know how accurate that is, and we're pretty sure they talked about not always doing it right that day. Right, so what we're working on now is building a bunch of sensors to do all kinds of things, one of which has the entire lab highly entertained. We're pretty sure that we can sense when a baby has pooped, and we're pretty sure we can sense whether it's bottle-fed or breastfed. Those kinds of things that we think might have clinical relevance, but no one's ever been able to sense before. But also looking at things like the air quality in general. In the Inland Empire, where most of our kids are, air quality is really bad. Asthma rates are really high. We want to start to log this stuff now and see if it has an impact later on. All of these different things are sort of all things that we're looking at. We're also looking at parental mood and social interactions to start to understand, can we explain to parents how them being healthy and happy and all of these things actually impacts baby health. And this is particularly important for premature infants because depression in mothers is about 40% in the premature infant space, which is much, much higher than the other. So, and looking at sort of how can we visualize these things, very much motivated by sort of the glanceable displays work that Sunny Consalvo and other folks have been looking at, and sort of showing both baby health and mom health over time. And I won't go through the details of this, but this is the rough sort of idea of like sensors, phone, lots of feedback there, store everything in Health Vault, and then the clinics and regional centers can actually look at the stuff in Health Vault. Ideally, what we'd like to do is get that hooked into our EMR directly, but that takes a long time. So right now we're satisfying ourselves with our CIO of the hospital has decided that he will put a link in from the patient record to Health Vault, and we feel like that's a pretty good step. So over time, we'll get to another place. So, kids who start out with chronic illness often become adults with chronic illness. And even if they don't become adults with chronic illness, they worry that they might have some other illness crop up over time. And so there's a fear, a not unjustified fear amongst clinicians, parents, and everyone else that we're going to have way too much data, and where the heck are we going to put it all? So as I mentioned, we're putting in a new EMR at UCI right now. I won't get into the details of this, but if you care about a giant EMR study, I'd be happy to talk to you later. We're doing this sort of 5-year longitudinal study of the EMR deployment at our hospital, which includes an obscene amount of field work and surveys of thousands upon thousands of people every 6 months, and so on. And of course, we're uncovering all kinds of massive issues, but people are sort of cautiously optimistic about what's going to happen, and happily the leadership is starting to really embrace the idea that the policies and the organizations and so on are much more important than the actual technology, and none of that is news to any of you. In the meantime, while we're all waiting for these fabulous electronic medical records, people say, well, why can't patients just handle their own records? And this is very much the sort of path that folks like Robert Wood Johnson and the whole ODL movement are pushing on, is just, why can't we do sort of what Germany and China and other countries have done and put all this responsibility in the hands of the patient? I have mixed feelings about that. I mean, primarily because of health literacy issues and technological literacy issues. But if we sort of put those to the side and just talk about the highly educated, highly technical people who might actually use these systems, we sort of want to know why aren't people using them and what are their problems and those kinds of things. So I have a student who's been looking at sort of both the usability and usefulness of these kinds of systems. And for a variety of reasons, we picked Health Vault, Google Health, and World MedCard as the 3 systems we would look at. We're trying to only look at systems that are highly patient-centric as opposed to ones that are sort of add-ons to EMRs. And started to look at both traditional usability evaluations, but also could we do heuristic evaluations with these kinds of systems, because that's something that's really not done in sort of the medical informatics area right now, and doing lots of interviews. None of this is probably going to be that surprising to you, but these are huge issues. If we can't fix these things, then we're not going to be able to sort of do this concept of grabbing all of these daily data. Physicians just don't have time, and this is what I was just talking to Corey about this morning. If you can't bill for it, you can't look at it. And if you can't bill for sending email or looking at ODL data, then how are we going to ever actually ask physicians to integrate this into your workflow? And often we heard from physicians, particularly younger physicians, interestingly enough, I mean, the sort of closer you were to medical school, it correlated, said they didn't trust patients to take their own data. The much more experienced physicians tended to be more comfortable. I don't know exactly what's going on with that, but I think it's kind of interesting. We obviously have a medical jargon issue, and we need to do something about the translation of the data and the way that people are talking about it. And this is the one that Desney finds the most entertaining. Trust in corporations had the biggest impact. Microsoft was the most trusted of the three that we looked at. World MedCard people said, I don't know who this is, because they're just a PHR company. So that was really suspect. And Google, everyone thought they were going to sell their health data for ads. I'm pretty sure, by the way, that Google will not do that. But you did see that. The few times that we saw Microsoft maligned in this way was about well, sometimes Windows crashes, so I think that they might lose my health data. You'd see these kinds of connections, but certainly the reputation of the individual company had a lot to do with it. We're generating a huge amount of data. As I said earlier, I'm sort of complicit in this problem of generating more data. So partly to appease my conscience, I also have students doing a lot of work in looking at these issues of if we have all of these tracking and recording technologies on a daily basis, how the heck are people to make any sense of them? And so David Nguyen has been looking at sort of figuring out how do we create new evaluation methods and various kinds of strategies for actually approaching people about these kinds of everyday tracking technologies, and how can we help people reason about these. And I would argue that the sort of legal definition of information privacy is really outdated in light of these new kinds of technologies and new kinds of data. So that's more of we can talk about another time. So just to sum up, the big issues with kids and chronic care, we have these dynamic networks of caregivers that are all trying to share information. They sort of have this mostly well-intentioned fumbling towards this general shared goal, and a giant shift in the power relationship between sort of clinicians and so on into parents and patients. All kinds of issues with sensing a dynamic baseline and the clinic no longer being the primary site of care. So huge challenges, but that's why we're doing the work. And we're starting to see a lot of sort of promise in this direction. I think a lot of other people are as well. So that's it. And this is all the people who actually do the work. And I ran off half my audience throughout the day.
Questions? So you didn't, many of the approaches you're taking in particular with sensing approaches would be related to elder care. This is another space I don't really know that much about, but I'm surprised that you didn't. It seems like much of what you're doing would apply equally well to sort of chronic elder care.
I think that's absolutely true, and we certainly borrow a lot of techniques. Actually, with the social compass work, we're borrowing, the postdoc that I have working on that did all her dissertation work in an elder facility and looking at trying to detect aggression between elders, which is actually a similar sort of sensing problem of social proximity that you might see in kids. So we use a lot of those kinds of techniques, and I think they're very interchangeable. The autism community is hugely interested in the smart home kind of idea right now. So if anyone was worried the smart home was dead, it is being revived because parents are really concerned. Kids with autism live basically as long as anyone else. So you have, as opposed to like a kid with Downs who has a much shorter lifespan. So parents are really worried what's going to happen after they are no longer around to take care of their kids. So they become very interested in sort of assisted living and semi-independent living. So yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I don't have a particularly good reason for why I don't specifically work in elder care, other than, I don't know, I guess I'm motivated by the kids. But I think you're right. There's a lot of overlap there.
You actually mentioned exactly the set of projects that I would have. There's an exact complement of the set I was thinking were specifically related to. I was thinking more the latter part about PHR usability and sensing of more typical physiological sensing of movement and activity and things like that. You get good reasons why all the I was you have convincing but surprising reasons why the autism work would actually be relevant, because those were my last guesses.
Right. No, it's interesting. I mean, the PHR stuff as well, and actually video conferencing is one that you see And this is partly a billing issue. So senior centers, assisted living facilities, they have the way that they are paid and pay for things is very centralized, right? So for them, if you look at it from an economic model, the transport costs of bringing someone to the clinician are actually very high, so they're actually willing to then pay for telemedicine visits that other kinds of insurance companies wouldn't, because they don't want to have to bring someone in. And so that's where you start to see some of those kinds of things popping up. And I think we'll continue to see more of this. My thesis advisor used to draw a little diagram. I don't actually know why I'm drawing this, but because it's pretty easy. But you sort of see, if this is independence, this is you're born, and this is you're dying, and elder care tends to be sort of the make this slope go out like this, and kids with autism tends to be about this slope as well, and trying to make it so that you can get kids more independent more quickly. So I think there's some sort of looking at that as independence as the measure. So
how far are you in the 5-year study?
18 months in. I never, ever, if you would have asked me if I would do this kind of work.
Is the EMR doing the study? What EMR is it?
They're putting in Eclipsis. So it's really interesting, primarily because I've just never had this much data. So, I have survey responses from, 2,000 people every 6 months. And
they're not transitioning from EMR, they're transitioning from no EMR.
From no EMR. The last time the systems were heavily updated was when they went to TDS about 20 years ago. And of course, we have people who've come from other places that have, mostly what you hear is I used Epic at such and such a hospital, and you're making me use Eclipsis, and, you're very bad people for doing this, right? But whether, the debate about Epic and Eclipsis, I don't know. But of course, it's a phased rollout. So part of the challenge that you're seeing is they're often comparing a fully formed EMR to, we haven't even put in ambulatory yet. And so, there's some confusion there. The other thing that's also funny is, this sort of reminds me of the people who are like, I don't want the government to take my Medicare, right? Or whatever, I don't want the government to control my Medicare because people don't have that connection. We have the same thing going on here where people say, oh, I hate this new system. I wish we had Eclipsis, because they've codenamed the system Quest for quality something, I don't know, it's an acronym. And so they're like, oh, Quest's terrible. I used Eclipsis at such and such. And so we see the same kind of thing. But people they feel really passionately about it. And we have a huge public health department that really is about patient empowerment. It's one of the things that UCI is kind of known for in that space. And so there was huge lobbying to basically say, we will basically strike on your system, the MDs who are also public health researchers, unless you guarantee us that we'll put a PHR in. And so that was coincidentally around the same time as the Eclipsis Health Vault deal was kind of happening. So we got pretty lucky because everyone said, oh, okay, yeah, we promise we'll put Health Vault in. But we do have people that feel really passionately about all these different issues.
What's the state of that part of the deployment?
I think the PHR will come in about a year, I think. Deadlines are malleable. We're about 2 years behind on our deployment. I mean, this is sort of the thing that cracks me up about all the, we've got to have EMRs in every clinic, across the country by such and such a year, which keeps changing. Vendor selection started 7 years ago for us, and we won't finish this deployment for sure for another 4.
Are you working closely with Eclipsis on, it seems like they're getting a good deal out of you doing this research in terms of the progress of the deployment.
Yeah, it's tricky. So I don't directly talk with the Eclipsis vendors if I can help it, but our CIO does a lot. And he shares our information back with them. But the main reason that I have avoided that is because the kind of research that they have tended to do is very much case studies, and they're always positive, right? And what what we know is that we're going to see some spectacular failures over the next few years. And thankfully, our hospital leadership is really fine with that and they're open to it. But I don't think Eclipsis would be as open. My guess. So, okay.
Cool.
Can I
Thanks.
de-mic?